the prisoner America feared most. A true crime story the system couldn't control. Before you blink, the door slammed shut. If you're brave enough to step inside America's darkest prison story, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments, could the system really control what it created? The day the system lost control, the alarm didn't scream at first. It clicked, soft, mechanical, almost polite, like a warning the prison itself wasn't sure it wanted to give. In the early hours of a tense federal morning, a correctional officer lay motionless inside a concrete maze designed to break men without ever spilling blood. The walls were bare, the lights unforgiving, and the silence so heavy it felt engineered. By the time backup arrived, the question wasn't what happened. It was how this was allowed to happen again. The name that followed the alarm traveled faster than the sirens. Thomas Silverstein. To the outside world, he was invisible. To the Bureau of Prisons, he was a problem that refused to stay contained. Long before ADX Florence became a symbol of total isolation, Silverstein was already forcing the system to admit an uncomfortable truth. America's prisons were built to punish, not to control the uncontrollable. Silverstein didn't arrive as a legend. He arrived like thousands of others, angry young, already hardened by violence and survival. The federal system believed routine procedures, rigid schedules, and authority would grind him down. Instead, the opposite happened. Every attempt to contain him revealed a weakness. Every move intended to suppress him escalated the danger. Inside the prison, time moved differently. Days blurred into identical stretches of concrete, steel, and watchful eyes. Guards followed protocols that had worked for decades. Counts were taken. Doors were checked. Chains were secured. And yet, somewhere between routine and complacency, the system lost its grip. Investigators would later describe the atmosphere leading up to the killing as tense but familiar. Silverstein had been placed under strict supervision, isolated from other inmates, his movements limited to a narrow schedule. He wasn't loud. He wasn't reckless. That was what made him terrifying. He was patient, calculating, watching. The murder shattered the illusion that isolation alone could neutralize danger. This wasn't a spontaneous act. It was a message, one delivered from inside the most controlled environment the government could offer. When word reached Washington, officials didn't just see a dead officer. They saw a precedent forming, one that threatened the credibility of the entire federal prison system. Who was Thomas Silverstein really? To answer that, investigators had to go backward, past the sirens, past the sealed reports, back to a time when the system still believed it had options. Silverstein's early years inside federal custody were marked by affiliations that promised protection but demanded loyalty. Prison gangs thrived in the shadows, operated with rules stricter than any written policy. Violence wasn't chaos, it was currency. And Silverstein learned quickly how power actually moved behind bars. Officials attempted transfers, hoping distance would dilute influence. Instead, each move spread his reputation further. Guard began to recognize his name before his face. Inmates whispered about him with a mix of fear and admiration. The system labeled him high risk. But the label did nothing to slow what was coming. After the second killing, the response was immediate and severe. Silverstein was placed in conditions so restrictive they bordered on experimental. 23 hours a day alone. Meals slid through slots. Human contact reduced to voices through steel. The intention was clear. If interaction fueled danger, then isolation would starve it. But isolation didn't erase Silverstein's presence. It sharpened it. Psychologists warned that extreme confinement could have unpredictable effects. Civil rights groups raised alarms. Prison officials pushed back, arguing that safety demanded sacrifice. Somewhere in that clash, Silverstein became more than an inmate. He became a test case. How far could the system go to protect itself? As months turned into years, the federal government faced a dilemma with no clean solution. Every existing facility had limits. Every protocol had already failed once. And Silverstein remained alive, alert and unbroken. That's when the conversations began. Quiet at first, then urgent. What if the problem wasn't the prisoner? What if the problem was the prison? Plans emerged for a facility unlike any other. A place designed not for rehabilitation, Not even for punishment, but for absolute control. No groups, no shared spaces, no opportunities for influence. A prison where men like Silverstein would exist in permanent separation from each other, from guards, from the world itself. ADX Florence wasn't built because of one man. But without Thomas Silverstein, it likely would not exist in the form we know today. Before construction began, officials needed one last assurance. Could Silverstein be contained long enough for the solution to be built? Then came the discovery that changed everything. During a routine internal review, investigators uncovered intelligence suggesting that Silverstein's influence hadn't vanished with isolation. It had adapted. Information was moving. Messages were being passed. And somewhere within the lock systems meant to silence him, a flaw had opened, a flaw big enough to kill. The report ended with a chilling line, one that never made it to the public. If current measures fail, the next incident may not be contained within prison walls. And that's when the fear truly set in, because the system wasn't just losing control of a prisoner. It was losing control of the idea that absolute isolation was enough. And when they realized where the failure was coming from, everything they believed about security collapsed. The prison built for one man. By the time the report reached senior officials, fear had replaced confidence. The system had done everything it was designed to do: segregation, restrictions, silence, and still, Thomas Silverstein remained dangerous. Not because he was loud, not because he was visible, but because he had learned how to operate inside the gaps no one wanted to admit existed. The Bureau of Prisons had a choice: admit failure, or build something so extreme it could never be questioned again. They chose the second. The early blueprints didn't look like a prison. They looked like a vault. Thick concrete walls. Cells designed to eliminate blind spots. Doors that could be controlled remotely without a guard ever stepping close. Movement reduced to a science. Human interaction treated like a liability. The facility would sit far from cities, buried in isolation, surrounded by nothing but open land and silence. Its name would be ADX Florence. Inside the federal system, everyone knew why it was really being built. Silverstein was transferred again, this time under conditions so secretive they bordered on classified. The journey itself was treated like a national security operation. Routes changed, timetables altered. No one involved knew more than they needed to. Officials weren't just moving a prisoner. They were trying to outrun a reputation. When Silverstein arrived at ADX Florence, the prison wasn't finished, not fully. Some systems were still being tested. Some protocols were still theoretical. But the urgency outweighed caution. He was placed into a cell that would define the rest of his life. A concrete box, a narrow window angled toward the sky, a bed poured from stone, no bars, no contact, no sound except his own breathing. The government believed this would end the story. It didn't. Inside ADX, Silverstein became something the system had never fully accounted for, a living contradiction. He was completely isolated, yet his presence shaped policy. He spoke to no one, yet his name dominated meetings. He had no physical reach, yet decisions across the federal prison network revolved around him. Psychologists evaluated him through glass and paperwork. Guards followed procedures down to the second. Every movement was logged, every item inspected. And still, the tension never eased, because Silverstein wasn't deteriorating the way they expected. Years passed. Other inmates broke. Some lost touch with reality. Others begged for transfer, for noise, for anything resembling human contact. Silverstein endured. He adapted. The isolation that was meant to crush him became something else. Something officials didn't want to name. Control. Outside the prison, the story began to leak. Journalists filed requests. Advocacy groups raised questions. How long could someone be held like this? What did it say about a system that needed a place like ADX to function? Was this justice, or fear dressed up as policy? The Bureau of Prisons responded with silence and statistics. Safety demanded sacrifice. Extreme inmates required extreme measures. The public, still haunted by headlines of prison violence, largely accepted the explanation until something went wrong. During a routine systems audit, Technicians discovered inconsistencies, minor at first, timing mismatches, logs that didn't align perfectly. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, but in a place where perfection was a promise, even small errors mattered. Investigators were brought in quietly. What they found unsettled everyone involved. Silverstein had been responding to changes before they occurred. He adjusted behavior in ways that suggested anticipation, not reaction. Schedules altered, and he adapted instantly. Procedures tightened, and he seemed already prepared. It was as if he understood the system as well as those running it. The implication was chilling. Someone somewhere had been predictable enough for Silverstein to study, not communicate with, but learn from. ADX Florence was built to eliminate human error, but it was still run by humans. Guards rotated shifts. Administrators followed patterns. Maintenance occurred on schedules. Even silence had a rhythm. Silverstein had years to observe it. Officials debated whether this constituted a real threat or an uncomfortable coincidence. No evidence of outside contact existed. No messages. No contraband. No violations on record. Just a growing sense that the prison was being watched from the inside. Then came the memo that changed everything. A senior administrator flagged a concern about internal morale. Guards assigned to ADX were experiencing burnout at unprecedented rates. Isolation wasn't just affecting inmates. It was affecting staff. Decision-making slowed. Attention drifted. Minor lapses became more frequent. Silverstein didn't need access to people. He needed time. As pressure mounted, officials faced a new dilemma. The very prison designed to neutralize him was now shaping itself around his existence. Resources diverted. Policies rewritten. Staff reassigned. ADX Florence had become a monument to one man's capacity to force change without ever leaving his cell. Civil liberties groups seized the moment. Lawsuits followed. Reports surfaced questioning whether indefinite isolation crossed a line the Constitution was never meant to approach. Silverstein became a symbol, whether he wanted to or not, a figure at the center of a national argument about punishment, control, and fear. Inside ADX, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the prison had stopped feeling invincible. During a late-night review, an analyst noticed something buried in years of data, a pattern so subtle it had been overlooked repeatedly. Behavioral shifts, timing correlations, responses that aligned not with policy changes, but with personnel changes. Silverstein wasn't reacting to the prison. He was reacting to the people running it. The realization hit like a cold wave. ADX had been designed to remove the human element from control, but humans were still the ones enforcing it. And Silverstein had spent decades studying systems built by people who believed they were unbreakable. The analyst report ended with a recommendation few wanted to read. The subject's threat is no longer physical. It is systemic. If that assessment was correct, then Silverstein was no longer just an inmate. He was a stress test the system was failing. And just as officials began discussing changes, new rotations, new oversight, new safeguards, an unexpected incident forced their hand. A sealed internal communication surfaced, never meant to be seen outside the Bureau. It revealed that Silverstein's confinement status had been quietly reclassified months earlier. Not because he was improving, but because the system feared acknowledging what he still represented. The question was no longer whether Thomas Silverstein could be controlled. The question was whether the prison built to contain him was starting to crack under its own design. And when the next decision was made behind closed doors, it would place everyone involved, guards, officials, and system itself, on a collision course with consequences no one could fully predict. The silence that answered back. By the time officials admitted the truth to themselves, it was already too late to undo what had been built. ADX Florence had succeeded at exactly what it was designed to do: erase chaos through control. No riots, no hostage situations, no blood on the floor. On paper, it was a triumph. But beneath the statistics, another reality had taken shape. The prison had not eliminated danger. It had transformed it. Thomas Silverstein no longer needed to act. He had become a constant, an immovable presence around which the entire system quietly adjusted. Procedures were written with his name unspoken, but implied. Staff rotations changed to reduce exposure. Policies hardened not because of new threats, but because of old ones that refused to fade. And then, one morning, the report stopped changing. Silverstein's behavior flattened into near stillness. No deviations, no adjustments, no reactions. Psychologists noted the shift immediately. After decades of minute but measurable engagement with his environment, he appeared to withdraw completely. He ate, he slept, he waited. Some believed it was decline. Others suspected something else. Inside federal leadership, the questions surfaced in whispers. Had the system finally won? The answer arrived quietly, without alarms or headlines. During a comprehensive review ordered after years of litigation pressure, analysts compared ADX outcomes to their original projections. Violence was down. Control was absolute. But the cost was impossible to ignore. Staffing shortages. Mental health crises among personnel. Legal challenges stacking up in federal courts. The prison designed to neutralize extreme inmates was slowly exhausting the people meant to run it. And at the center of every justification sat the same example. Thomas Silverstein. He had become the reason ADX existed, the proof it was necessary, and the shadow it could never escape. His isolation was cited in court filings, his history referenced in policy memos, his name invoked whenever questions grew too uncomfortable. Silverstein himself said nothing. When he finally spoke publicly, through carefully filtered legal channels, it wasn't confession or demand. It was an observation. He described time not as punishment, but as pressure. He described silence not as emptiness, but as information. He never asked for release. He never asked for sympathy. He asked whether a system built to remove human unpredictability could survive without becoming something unrecognizable. The statement unsettled everyone who read it, because it wasn't defiance. It was diagnosis. As years passed, Silverstein's physical presence diminished. Age did what isolation could not. His health declined. His movement slowed. But the structure built around him remained, unchanged, unquestioned, still operating at full intensity. New inmates arrived at ADX with no knowledge of the man whose existence had shaped the walls around them. Guards followed protocols without remembering why they were written that way. The origin story faded, replaced by routine. Then, quietly, Thomas Silverstein died. No incident, no confrontation, no dramatic end, just a notice issued, a file closed, a name archived, some expected relief. What followed instead was discomfort, because nothing changed. ADX Florence didn't loosen. Isolation didn't ease. Policies didn't soften. The prison continued exactly as it had before, now without the man who had justified its most extreme measures. That was the final twist. Silverstein had not been the threat holding the system together. He had been the excuse. In the months after his death, internal reviews raised questions no one had wanted to ask while he was alive. If the most feared prisoner in America was gone, why did the system still need to operate at its harshest setting? If the danger had ended, why hadn't the fear? There was no clear answer. Because fear, once engineered into policy, doesn't retire quietly. ADX Florence remains open today, a place defined less by the inmates inside it than by the decisions made to build it. A monument to control, born from failure, sustained by precedent. Thomas Silverstein never escaped, never led a riot, never spoke to the public directly. And yet, his impact stretched farther than most criminals who ever walked free. He forced the system to reveal itself, not through chaos, but through silence. And that silence still echoes in every concrete corridor where human contact is measured in minutes and days, are counted by doors opening and closing without voices attached. They believed locking him away would end the threat. Instead, it changed the rules forever. And if one man could reshape an entire institution without ever leaving his cell, the question that lingers isn't about Thomas Silverstein at all. It's about what happens when a system built for safety becomes too afraid to let go of its own worst-case scenario. Because the prisoner America feared most is gone, but the prison he left behind is still very much alive. If this story stayed with you, the next one will go even deeper. Subscribe, Because some cases don't end when the cell door closes.